So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending another one of our Cornwall Conversations. Today, we're going to hear from Ed Greene, I think he's on the left, and Frédéric, who is on the right, and they're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in what it is, what it isn't, what it does, what it doesn't do, where it's headed, and we're going to go along for the ride. Before we start, I just want to say a couple of things. We're a library that needs donations, so please look at the bottom of your screen and donate when you can. And there's a chat box for questions, and we'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you all for attending. And Frédéric, you want to start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting both of us to talk about what is certainly across the world a very hot topic. I thought that I wanted to start with describing some of the forces which have helped shape the data economy. This will allow us first to better understand what the data economy is all about, but also to understand some of the questions that we have and that we will try to discuss tonight. So let me share my screen. And start with this. I think that it's useful to have in mind the fact that there are three major developments in the last 2 decades, which have contributed to the data economy. First of all, the growth of the internet. Second, the increase in power of computers and the ability to compute. And finally, artificial intelligence, which was made possible by the first 2 developments. So on the internet, I find it always interesting to remind ourselves that it didn't start until in fact, for the general public, until the early 90s, so that's not that far. In 1970, there was the first attempt to make 2 computers communicate with each other. By the way, the internet was developed with a fair amount of support of the US Defense Department, because the Defense Department was interested in trying to make sure that its computers, which were in different locations, could communicate with each other. So it wanted to develop that technology, which eventually led to the internet. And it's fairly striking to see that between 1990 or 1989 and 2020, so in 30 years, there are now nearly 5 billion people who are active internet users, which is 56% of the global population. I was wondering whether Cornwall was included in this, because the service is not always perfect in Cornwall. But it basically means that there has been a huge development, and internet has become a very important means of communication. Now, this is important for us because, and I will say more about this later, it allows the gathering of a huge amount of data. The second feature is the increase in computing capacity. So you can see on the vertical axis here that we start from a unit which is 1 trillion, and we go to 100,000 trillion between 1995 and 2020. So the capacity to compute has been multiplied by 100,000 in the space of 25 years, and it keeps increasing. Now, this is very useful because artificial intelligence requires a lot of computing capacity. By the way, you may want to compare with the computing capacity with human computing capacity. So you have here the scale where, so right now we are at the level of in between a mouse and a monkey, roughly. And a human has an even more important capacity to compute. But you can see that we are increasing very fast, and the expectation is that by 2060, computers will have the same capacity as the human mind to compute. Besides the capacity to compute, there is the capacity to store data and retrieve data. And on this, I have what was a storage, 1956. It was the IBM Model 350 disk file. And to the right, you have the ScanDisk ultra little chip, which can store 25,600 times more things than this enormous machine that you have on the left. So that's one of the illustration of how much we have increased our capacity to store data and to retrieve it, which is going to be useful for artificial intelligence, of course. And the world is now littered with data centers, and those are expanded, new ones are being built all over the place. So that contributes to the development of the capacity to store data. This is another illustration. You can see that the green part here, which was very, very thin in 2000, is now extremely large. And this is the capacity to store digital information, to store data. So you can see how fast it is increasing over time in a period of only 20 years. Now, this allows us to come to artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence started really in 1950 when Turing suggested that humans are fairly rational people. They make decisions based on the information they have, and they try to maximize what it is that they want to maximize, and that he saw no reason why machines wouldn't be able to do the same thing. And this started a movement to try to develop algorithms, which are programs, in fact, to mimic the human mind so that computers would be able to do the same kind of maximization of objectives that we could. In the 60s and the 70s, there was a severe limitation in the development of artificial intelligence, even though the idea was there, precisely because we did not have yet sufficient computing power, capacity, and storage capacity for data. And this slowed down the movement towards artificial intelligence. But the movement started again in the 1980s, and artificial intelligence became very popular in the 1990s. One of the first well-known event was in 1997 when Garry Kasparov was defeated by IBM Deep Blue computer program. So this was the first time that a machine was able to defeat a human mind, and a pretty sharp one at that, playing chess. You'd be interested to know that there's been further development in artificial intelligence, and which I'm going to say a word about in a second. But in 2018, there was another experiment, this time with playing poker. And the algorithm wasn't told. I mean, this was created at Caltech in the US, and the algorithm wasn't told how to play. The algorithm was only told what winning was, okay? And then it was told to win. So at starts, it had no idea of how to play poker. But by learning from the data and learning from its own experience, it realized that you had to bluff. And the machine started to bluff and won over the three best poker player of this particular poker. Okay, so those games are just illustration to show that programs can, by mimicking to a certain extent what the human mind does, and by learning themselves from their own mistakes, can maximize or can predict. The development was not only in the game area, but a lot of the development was in photo recognition and also in language recognition, to have translating machines that would be able to understand the meaning of a sentence and then translate it into a foreign language. As this was going on, the original learning machines were machines where you just put a lot of data and you let the computer sort out the structure of the data and make prediction from its ability to see in the data things that we don't see very easily as humans. So there was not a lot of thought that's going on in there, but there's a lot of ability, capacity to process data and to analyze it in order to make predictions. And then we went to machine learning, which was a second step, where you had programs where not only could the machine interpret the data, but they could also correct themselves and improve their own performance by analyzing their past mistakes and correcting them. So we moved to the machine learning, and deep learning is just a third level of sophistication of those machines. So I'm not going to go into particular deep details about deep learning. So this is the artificial intelligence mind, and this is the human mind. So they are a bit different. And I think it's important to understand that they are in fact quite different in many ways. You can use artificial intelligence and you can use a program to do a task very well. So you feed a lot of data. The machine is able to use this data and analyze it to predict what should happen or what it should do. So it's a very objective mechanism, just maximization. It is not very energy intensive for each operation. And the algorithm relies on data, on instruction, and computing power. So with the computing power, it analyzes the data and then is able to predict what it should do or what is going to happen. But there are severe limitations to artificial intelligence, which make you wonder whether it should be called intelligence at all. For example, artificial intelligence has no memory. So it can analyze the data if you give him an objective. And the next day, if you want to give him another objective, to give the program another objective, you have to start all over again. Give him another set of data, another rule, and then let the machine learn. It cannot do several tasks simultaneously, at least up to this point. It can do one task very well. It can compute very fast, but it cannot do multitasking, which the human mind is pretty good at doing because we solve all kinds of problems simultaneously. And we use some of the things that we've learned in one task to solve some of the other problems. So it has no ethics, of course. I'm not talking about the social skills of computers because it's fairly limited at this point. Scientists are working on trying to develop this, but they are far from, and of course, there's no self-awareness, which is part of human intelligence. Now, human intelligence relies on computing power. That's your brain. You saw, which has all those nodes, and there's communication between those nodes, but it relies on memory, very much so. And one example, for example, that I can give is, let's say that you start a video game that you've never played with before, and you see that there are cars rushing in the streets and or people with guns. Well, you immediately know that you want to avoid being run over by a car or being killed by a gun, even if you haven't been told what the game is all about, because you know from general experiences of the past that it's not good to be run over by cars, or it's not good to be killed by bullets. The algorithm would not know that, would have to be told that in order to play the game, because the algorithm has no memory. The human mind can easily adapt to changes, can multitask, do several things at the same time, or make different decisions. Of course, has self-awareness, but it doesn't have, I mean, it has more capacity to compute, but it is slower at computing than the algorithm. It may be subjective, because as Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize for studying the human mind, he got the Nobel Prize in economics, said there are two parts of our minds. There is thinking fast and thinking slow. And thinking fast is when you intuitively answer a question. Well, maybe the answer is not going to be very accurate, but it's your intuition that you're going to use rather than your logical function. So the human mind is possibly less accurate, particularly when it uses thinking fast mechanism than the computer. And the human mind uses more energy per operation than the computer. One of the things that I want to mention about the limitations of it in artificial intelligence, you remember artificial intelligence is based on having a lot of data of things which have happened in the past, putting them in a computer, making the computer understand what the structure of this data is, and therefore develop its ability to predict. Well, if the data that you feed into the computer has a bias, because there were biases, whether it's bias, racial bias or any other bias, the computer is going to have the same bias because it just works on the basis of past data. So this is something which is a little bit worrisome. In fact, the fact that the computer cannot adapt to changes, if you think about the algorithm which are developed now for the self-driving car, so we feed into the computer all possible events that could happen on a street or on a road. Okay. Everything which has been recorded in the past is fed into the computer, and the computer understands what is the structure of what it should do based on this data, which is fed into the computer by analyzing it. But of course, there has never been a Martian, for example, walking down, as far as we know, walking down a road or a street. And if there was one, the self-driving car would have no clue as to what to do, because there would be no data on which it could have based its prediction of what it should do and shouldn't do. So in a sense, artificial intelligence is limited to the systematic exploration of what has already taken place, for which there is data, but has no imagination about things that could happen, but have never taken place. Okay, so now that we had in the early 2000s, both the computing ability, the ability to store, and also the fact that many more people were connected to the internet. And when you use the internet, you leave a trace of what you do. I mean, it's easy to know that you were connected with some other person or some other service at a given time. So we have a lot of data, the ability to compute, the ability to store the data, and we have those programs which are analyzing the data in order to predict what could be done. So that's artificial intelligence as we know it now. That means that all of a sudden the world changed because there was one new resource which we had not, I mean, it always existed. I'm sure that in Cornwall, when somebody walks down the street, the neighbors who see that person going down the street note that, and this is a piece of information that they may use at a later time. But all of a sudden, we are in a world where there are masses of data to be used and the ability to use them to predict. And this has a number of uses. One of the most obvious use right now is helping develop the vaccine for COVID. Now, if we have, let's say, I think there was 500,000 people who died in the US in a year, it usually takes 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. So if you can shorten that to 1 year, you save, 2 million lives, I mean, more than 2 million lives. So that's pretty important. And in fact, in this case, Google was quite important in being able to predict what the structure of those little spikes. Those little spikes are things that attach to your cell and infect you. And in order to find a vaccine, one has to find the structure of the spikes and then an agent which is going to prevent them from infecting you. And by using artificial intelligence, Google was in a few months able to come up with the likely structure of the spikes. It turned out that among the prediction that the Google program gave, it was right. And this allowed the development of vaccines that we have now. So that's one particularly useful thing that one can do with artificial intelligence. There are many applications, by the way, in medicine of artificial intelligence, because programs are much better at interpreting data, let's say an X-ray or a scan, than even specialist doctors. So you get sometimes, at least for some types of diseases, it's much better to rely on artificial intelligence because they can recognize a tumor much better than doctors. But here you have an example, for example, in Kenya, there's quite a bit of artificial intelligence which is used in developing countries. This is one where you combine mobile phones with artificial intelligence so that people can self-diagnose, women in this particular case. And there are many other applications in the health field. I think that you have Waze in the US. Now Waze is a combination between geolocalization and artificial intelligence. It is based on data because every Waze user sends data about the traffic. It helps you benefit from a more fluid traffic or change your route to get where you want to go faster. Okay, so that's a very useful application as well. For the music lovers, Spotify is a third type of application where Spotify listens to what you listen to at different times of the day or different days of the week. It has analyzed every conceivable piece of music and it is able to use what it knows about music to create playlists which correspond exactly to your taste and makes you listen to musicians that you had never heard of, but who happen to be quite aligned with your taste. And that's why Spotify is so popular. So I'm going to stop here because there are many, many different types of applications. Now, let me finish by talking about digital platform. The internet is a place where it's easy to communicate, as we do tonight, with some people in New York, some people in Cornwall, some people in France, and it abolishes the notion of distances. So it's very useful for social interaction between people, among other things. And in a social interaction platform, all social interaction platforms are not digital. You all know newspapers. Well, a newspaper is typically a platform where you have two sets of clients. You have the advertisers on one side and you have the readers on the other side. And you sell the same paper both to the advertisers and to the readers. And you have what is called a network effect. The network effects comes from the fact that the more readers you have, the more people, advertisers, are ready to pay for advertising in your newspaper. The richer you are, the better your content, the more people you can have, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this kind of interdependency between several groups, mutually reinforcing each other, is very common on the internet, because the internet is a place where it's very easy to gather people to make them communicate. So that's what you have as social media platforms, for example. That's what they do. You can see all your friends and you can communicate with them very easily. Knowledge platform, where you have people who would like to get answers and you have people who put content, and the people who want to get the answers can look at the content. Media sharing platforms like Spotify, I just mentioned about it, where you want to have music that is to your taste, and you have musicians on the other side, and in between the two, there's a platform that makes sure that the musicians that you're presented with are the ones that you like, even if you don't know them. And you have service-oriented platforms like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, etc., that sell you a service. Amazon typically puts together sellers on retailers on one side and consumers on the other, and makes transactions between them very easy, much easier, because sometimes they're not even in the same location or in the same country. So we have multi-sided platforms, which are a common occurrence on the internet. And it's always the same principles. You have two groups, the producers and the consumers, and the platform in between makes the interaction between the two very easy. So if you think of Facebook, for example, Facebook, you have users, and on the other side, you have both developers of applications and also firms who want to advertise. Okay. Now, when you are on a market like this, it's a bit different from being in a traditional business. In a traditional business, you produce something, you have some costs, and you try to sell that something at a price which is presumably higher than your cost. Otherwise, you won't last very long. But when you're a newspaper, there's the question of, do you want the readers to pay? Or do you want only the advertisers to pay? Or do you want each one to pay a little bit? Now, in many cases, and that happens certainly in newspapers, you find out that you're better off distributing your newspaper for free, because that's going to attract more people, and that's going to make your advertising more valuable. So in that case, you offer a free service to at least one side of the platform in order to monetize and to increase the revenue you get on the other side. And this is very typically what happens in many platforms, not on all of them, on the internet. And Facebook, for example, offers a service which is free for the users, but makes money because the advertisers know that there are a lot of users. As a matter of fact, there are 2.7 billion users of Facebook, if you want to know how many there are. So that's nearly half the world population. So for an advertiser, that's a lot of exposure that you can get if you. So how does Facebook work? And this is getting to the questions that we want to ask. Facebook is interested in offering a variety of sharing options to enable users to exchange messages, to exchange videos, to exchange all kinds of things. So you can post, share photo, create event, upload videos, etc., etc. Okay. Now, to do this, Facebook is investing in technical developments because you want to have an app that is, for example, I was talking about Spotify before. When Spotify was created, it started by spending $2 billion to try to have a perfect sound. So to make sure that people who would listen to music would have a really good sound. And second, to make itself known to people. Okay, that cost $2 billion. Question is then, how do you recoup your investment? One of the ways to recoup your investment is to have the maximum number of users, because if you have a large number of users, then advertisers will be very willing to buy advertising on your platform. Okay, why are the advertisers interested? Not only because there are lots of people, but because Facebook has lots of data on who those people are, how they behave, whether they're young people or older people, whether they live in the countryside or in a city, etc. How often, what kind of things that they seem to like. So you can sell to the advertiser, not only the space, but also a set of data that will allow the advertiser to target the advertising to make sure that it is most relevant to the users. There's another thing which is, and this is the final thing, which is discussed. Facebook wants, in order to make its advertising most profitable, wants you to stay on Facebook as much as possible. And to ensure that you will stay on Facebook as much as possible, it knows your tastes because it has all this data, and it's going to try to feed you things that it knows you like. Well, that may create a problem in some cases because it may force you in some way to receive messages which are self-reinforcing in your own beliefs, because that's how they keep you on the face on which you are, and that's how they can increase the price of the advertising. So what are the problems that we have now, or the problems that we could debate? Well, the first one is the fact that what's very clear is that the greater the number of users you have, the more artificial intelligence algorithms have data that they can work with, the better is the service that they render, and the more is the number of people they attract. So there's a natural tendency towards dominance, towards having huge organizations. And when I was talking about Facebook, for example, with 2.7 billion users, this is a perfect example of this. So the question is, should we worry about this dominance, which is kind of built into the mechanism? What are the options if we are concerned about it? The second one is that in order to work, most of those platforms use the data that they have gathered. When you click on a link on the internet, they can know that you clicked on this. You clicked on, I don't know, armchairs for the garden. Well, they know that you are interested in armchair for the garden. So they can then use this information to tell manufacturers of garden supplies that maybe they should advertise with you because you seem to be interested in, and you seem to have a garden and you seem to be interested in garden furniture. So this is how the platforms make money, or not all of them, but a lot of them, particularly the ones that offer a free service. There's a big question about whether it's right that they should use this data, which is data not on what you've told your friends or not, but on the fact that you have certain tastes which can be recognized by the computer, and whether it's this use of data, personal data, should be regulated. The third one is, should there be a regulation of the practices that I've described, for example, in Facebook, where Facebook tries to keep you on Facebook as long as possible by feeding you content that it knows you like. Doesn't that reduces your horizon of being exposed to different things or different views or different political discourse? Does that create reinforcement, and does that undermine democracy by creating people who are constantly reinforcing their own beliefs and therefore are not communicating really or exchanging with others? Finally, one question which is much discussed, those platforms say, I'm just a platform, I'm not a newspaper, I do not have an editorial policy. So whatever you want to post, I'm here to facilitate your communication with others. What you want to communicate is your problem. It is not my problem. I'm just here to facilitate this communication, like a telephone company, okay? Telephone company has no view on whether what you say on the phone is right or is wrong. Question, we know that there's been a lot of incident of fake news, for example, and that this may have a detrimental effect on democracy. Should social media be allowed to censor what people put on their platforms? Should there be an authority, a public authority that should be in charge of that? Those questions are discussed and not solved. Finally, there's the question of whether this whole system is robust. We hear more and more about hacking of hospitals, for example. In France, we just had 2 major hospitals being hacked recently. It was hacked by people who are very knowledgeable on computer things, and the data was stolen, and the idea was that the data would be given back to the hospital only against the ransom now. Okay, so that's clearly not cybersecurity. Who should be in charge? Is there a real problem? Are we increasing the fragility of our economy by going digital? Those questions are also quite debated. So that was my little introduction. Jane, you have the floor.
Ed, you have the floor, right, exactly.
Yes, thank you. That was an outstanding presentation, Frédéric, especially for me, since I am not the most experienced in using technology. But I think you've highlighted that we're moving from what we call a tangible economy to a digital economy that is clearly transforming our lives. I see it in terms of my profession. I see it in terms of my access to information. And this is certainly reflected by the dominant companies in our society today. And those are Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Those companies have huge market capitalization and huge earnings, and really are the dominant companies in the US and increasingly globally. Though China is interesting in developing its alternatives to some of these companies, which are even larger. And with the continuing growth of computer power and its ability to store and analyze data, together with the growth of sophisticated algorithms, I think we'll continue to see new apps providing more and more services in many sectors of our lives and our economy. In fact, the consulting firm PwC predicts that artificial intelligence will add $15.7 trillion to the global economy by 2030. That is about 75% of our current GDP. And as Frédéric highlighted, artificial intelligence will perform many kinds of physical and intellectual tasks with a speed and power that far outstrips any human ability to do so, dramatically increasing productivity in everything from transportation to manufacturing and to medicine. But this sea change is going to require us to explore new thinking about a host of very important topics. First, digital property rights. Who owns the data collected by the various devices we use? Trade regulation with respect to the organization and sale of that data, for example, by Google and Facebook. What restrictions should there be on use of that data, the sale of that data, and notification to the creators of that data? Antitrust regulation, which we'll explore with the first question that was raised. Should antitrust regulation focus simply on consumer pricing or be expanded to consider other stakeholders in our society, such as citizens, workers, and businesses? As we'll explore, Google and Facebook have always said that they have really made their services less costly and have created a better marketplace with respect to this, but their size is enormous. The EU, as we'll explore in the first question, has taken action against Google, and size has become quite significant. Because take in mind that Facebook and Google have almost 90% of digital advertising, reflecting the growing mass of data they've been able to collect. And this is having a very significant impact on businesses such as newspapers, who have seen advertising revenues decline significantly, even though they depend upon those revenues to basically fund their expense. One of the things we'll explore as well in the questions that Frédéric raised is free speech. Are platforms free to either post or to connect to other platforms information without any concern as to the accuracy, fairness, maliciousness, or danger to society? And should there be any restrictions on surveillance empowered by access to this data, such as, for example, by the government or police departments, who have begun to use data such as facial recognition and other data to monitor activity in society? What are the implications of data for economic competitiveness and national security? And what is the impact of algorithmic disruption on work in the labor market, and what should our response be? And should we be concerned about the ethics of artificial intelligence? Why is it being assembled, and how is it being used? And should we worry about the health and well-being of users of digital technology who may become addicted to its use? And this has become a growing concern with respect to use by younger people and the impact on their growth and development. What I found fascinating is the average teenager spends 7.5 hours a day playing with screens and phones. And there is a concern that as a result, they're becoming more isolated, less social, and more prone to depression than previous generations. Now, we can't cover all of these topics today in the questions that we'll discuss, but our hope, however, has been to stimulate interest in exploring these issues. And in that regard, the library has recently acquired some relevant books that you might find of interest, which we'll post on the website. Now, some of these books are quite critical of the high-tech companies, in particular Google and Facebook. Unfortunately, they don't do a particularly good job highlighting the benefits that our society has realized from the development of these apps and the utilization of artificial intelligence. If you think of it today, my profession as a lawyer has been transformed by the access to information and technology. Our law firm no longer needs a library. Everything is online. And you think of what the impact has been. But on the other hand, there are some concerns that have been raised in these questions. And I think with that, Jane, let's go over to the questions if you'd like.
Okay, I have the first question here and I'm going to read it because paraphrasing it would be a bad idea. This question is at the forefront of the discussion with respect to whether antitrust law should focus not use and on effect.
No, read the question from Frédéric's slides. I can do that. One, the larger is the number of users of a service provided by a platform, the more data the provider of the service can get access to, the better the quality of the service will be thanks to artificial intelligence. The more dominant the provider of the service will be. Should we worry about this dominance? Does the problem depend on the type of platform we are talking about? If so, what are the options? And this question is at the forefront of the debate on antitrust and whether there should be a limit to the size that these platforms can grow to. And it used to be that we did focus on size and control with respect to networks, as we did back when we had to break up railroads and other companies. But the benefit today of the platforms and Amazon and others is that consumers have not, in a sense, been led to pay higher prices. There's no conspiracy to raise prices. And so the argument is that why should there be an antitrust concern if the market is efficient, that pricing is competitive, and that therefore consumers are benefiting? Now, the problem, though, is that while platforms such as Google and Facebook started as simply providing linkages, they've vastly expanded their business model. Google has stated in its prospectus that we began as a technology company and we've evolved into a software, technology, internet, advertising, and media company, all rolled into one. And Google has acquired 200 companies since it started. And Facebook and Amazon have acquired 79 and 89 respectively in the last decade. And so the consequence is that these are growing huge because to the extent that more users are attracted to the platform, the more data is collected, the more their revenues grow, the more their services can expand, and the more users will be attracted. Google represents today 88% of the US engine search market, and 95% of all mobile searches. Then the question is, does Google direct those searches to companies that it owns or does business with? And if so, what are the consequences with respect to competition? Amazon captures now over 1/3 of online retail spending. What is likely to be the effect, therefore, on shops that basically are open for us to come in off the street? 2/3 of Americans are on Facebook, and having purchased Instagram and WhatsApp, now owns 4 of the 8 social media apps. And these companies are now public, so there is pressure to generate increased sales and earnings, such that there is pressure on them to use their ecosystems to give their own products and services preference and keep competitors off their network. And this has also led to a growing concentration in certain industries because of the increasing use of technology. And that technology creates barriers to entry. The current view of antitrust is that if consumer pricing has been enhanced and not artificially inflated, then size should not be an issue. And that's the argument that Google has made in the EU and that it is made in the US. But there has been a call by many serious scholars to rethink this approach, and that antitrust action should not only include a broader view of consumer pricing and welfare, but also whether new companies have the ability to enter a market controlled by the tech monopolists such as Google and Facebook and have their products compete on the merits. The EU has taken a very aggressive position against Google and imposed a 2.7 billion fine on it for unfairly favoring its own services over those of its rivals, and then a $5 billion fine for abusing its dominance in the mobile market with Android, which it controls, and that dominates the supply of apps to mobile phones. I think we are going to have to face up to the fact that there's less and less competition against these platforms. They have enormous power in our society, and we don't have effective regulation or oversight with respect to how they operate, what they do, and the consequences if something were to go wrong. What the response will be will differ, I think, between the EU, between the US, China, and elsewhere. And what we probably need is some coordinated international approach to what the effective way of regulating these platforms are. But they're enormous and huge. And if you combine what is happening in China with what's going on in the US, they pose, in my mind, a huge regulatory challenge in terms of their impact on society. Your view, especially with respect to the European Union, I'd be interested in your response. You're muted, Frédéric.
Let me play the devil's advocate, just to make sure that we have an interesting debate. First of all, I agree with you that there's been a tradition of antitrust and competition law in Europe, which basically is trying to maximize the satisfaction of consumers. So anything that artificially increases prices, for example, is going to decrease the satisfaction of consumers, or something, a monopoly was going to restrict output. It means that some people are not going to be able to consume the goods, so that's not going to go in the direction of consumers. So indeed, when they face the digital services, and when they see that Facebook, which was created in 2008, so that's not very long time ago, okay? Particularly because it was the end of 2008. So it really started operating in 2009, in 11 years. Got 2.7 billion active users. It's pretty hard to say that it's clear that it has reduced the satisfaction of consumers, because otherwise, why are they active users of Facebook services? So we do have a problem with artificial intelligence, which is the fact that, as we said, the more the firm is, the larger the firm is, the more its artificial intelligence algorithm can be fed with data, and the better the service is that they give. So what it means is that large firms give better service than smaller competing firms. So that's completely different from what we see in the real economy. And that has been subject of considerable discussion, because do we really want to intervene against firms that, I mean, why are there 2.7 billion people looking at Facebook? There are 197 million people who shop on Amazon every year. Now, presumably those people could go to their neighboring store, or they could shop elsewhere. They don't have to shop on Amazon. So one has to assume that Amazon is doing something right, because otherwise it's incomprehensible how those people, and what it does right, we know what it does right. It is able to analyze exactly what you want and to provide you with selection of products which are very relevant once you get into a discussion on Amazon with them, because they remember what you bought last time, they remember what other people who liked what you bought also liked, and they are able to be more efficient in this way. So the difficulty in the digital world is to separate the concentration from the quality of the service. On top of this, not only is the price high, the price, at least of the service, is equal to zero, which never happens in the rest of the economy. So we have huge number of followers for a service, paying nothing for this service. You wonder whether you have a case that they are engaging into anti-competitive practices which are to the detriment of consumers. So some people say, well, I know better than consumers. Well, that's a very dangerous possibility. The second thing you said is that, yes, but some of those firms, in particular Facebook, by the way, acquired a large number of firms. This is absolutely true. So there is a suspicion, maybe they acquired those other firms because they wanted to avoid the competition from those other firms. That's hypothesis one. But unfortunately, there's a second hypothesis, which is just as likely. I am a computer geek. I've got great ideas of a new service that could be created. I start working on an algorithm. And once I have my algorithm, now I need to find customers. So either I do like what TikTok did, and TikTok paid advertising campaign up to nearly 500 million to try to make itself known so that people would get on TikTok. But if I don't have 500 million, I would be very happy to convince either Facebook or Microsoft or whoever that my application is likely to be very successful. They have the money to develop it. I'm very happy to sell for a high price my idea of a new service and a new algorithm. And a lot of those firms, actually, I mean, the jury is out on whether those mergers were beneficial, because what they, when a small firm gets bought by one of those very large tech company, it sends a message to anybody else who has an idea, a brilliant idea of something new, innovation. Do innovate, and you will be bought for a very high price by one of those guys. So there will be more innovation, and we like that. So it is not completely obvious whether we should have fought those mergers or whether those mergers were in fact contributing to increase the level of innovation in society, which is good.
Frédéric, you're right, but the US has been willing to accept that and therefore not been concerned. But Europe seems to be much more concerned about the size of Google and Facebook and how they basically make their products available and their size and their impact on society.
Yes.
What do you think that is?
Okay, that's true, but there's always been a difference between antitrust in the US and competition in Europe. And the difference is that the US has developed through individual freedom, personal initiative, competition, and all this. Whereas in Europe, large firms were usually state-owned enterprises that had lots of privileges, were not particularly efficient, but were able to displace competition. So we in Europe have a bias against anybody who is dominant, because we come from a culture where if a firm is dominant, it must mean that it has eliminated competition, because that's the typical pattern. In the digital world, it is not always obvious that this is what happened. So we have applied in Europe, and you took a very good example. You were right to say that Google Android was fined, I can't remember how many billions by Europe. Now, why was Android developed by Google? It was developed by Google because Apple, with its system iOS, had a monopoly. Google was the competitor, and it did very well as a competitor. Should it be considered to be a monopolist now? Question mark. So I do have my differences with what they do in Europe.
And it's interesting, in the US, we used to have the European approach to antitrust, but with the Chicago School of Economics, we began to focus on consumer pricing. And we thought that that really was the measure of antitrust conduct you would like to basically regulate. And to the extent that the consumer market has been made more efficient, and there's no pricing question here, that has been led to make it very difficult to bring cases against Amazon and Google simply based on size and the dominance that they have. And they clearly do dominate. And it would be very hard to have a significant competitor. And one of the consequences has been when you control so much of digital advertising, that's going to have a profound effect on some other industries, including media. Because how are they going to basically support if advertisers are going to go? And that maybe leads us to our next question, and that is the data. Do you want to read that, the second question, Jane, and then we can go into it?
Sure. Just give me 1 second because I wasn't expecting you to do that and I didn't have it right in front of me. Question 2. No, I don't, because I don't have a piece of paper that you have.
Is it right that platforms use the information they have gathered? Users use the platform either to sell it to third parties in extreme cases, or to allow advertisers to more effectively advertise their goods to the users. Should this practice be regulated? If so, what are the options? How can one compare the situation in Europe and in the US? And that, I think, is really one of the most interesting questions, because what is fascinating about these platforms is that they operate because their services are free, but they have to generate revenue. And the way they do that is to use the data that they collect from you in terms of your usage. Now, that data can be used in a variety of ways. First, it can help refine the searches conducted by the users so that they are more accurate with respect to responding what the user is seeking. Secondly, the data can be collected from the searchers and sold to advertisers, who in turn can place advertising on the platform. How many times when you go to Google to search, do you get pop-up on your screen, a Google ad, and you say, do you want to see this ad? And if so, why not? It happens all the time. Well, Google has been monitoring where I go in my searches, what I'm looking for, and will then send me an ad that may be relevant. Now, third, you can also sell that data to third parties who may want to identify potential participants in their platforms for political or other activities. Or the data can be sold to foreign governments, such as Russia, or Russia could basically have access to that data to decide how to and where to place advertisements. Thus, the issues I think that are faced is, first, should you inform users that you will be using data generated? And if so, how? Second, should users have to consent to the use of that data? And if so, how would they go about doing that? And could they revoke that consent if they decided that they were concerned as to how their data might be made available to third party? If the data is used, should it be subject to certain privacy constraints, and if so, what? And here we see an approach in the EU and California, which is really trying to deal with privacy concerns, which are right. Now, the data is of enormous value to companies such as Google and Facebook, but it is never listed on their balance sheet as data the way other tangible assets are. Rob Jackson, when he was a commissioner at the SEC and a colleague and friend of mine, said that digital data is so important to companies like Google and Facebook that it should be valued and carried on their balance sheets like other tangible assets, especially if it is being sold to various end users. And Google and Facebook are publicly held companies, and they have to report their financial condition. And are they really reporting what their true financial condition is, given that the data that they have is and what they can use it for? Nor do they necessarily disclose effectively what that data may be used for in the future and who has been approaching them. Now, the regulators have not followed up on Jackson's proposal, but it is fascinating to think about what the consequences would be. And since that data provided is so valuable, should there be some mechanism for reimbursing the users by the company for the data use that they put it to, or should consent be based on some form of payment, or is the free services sufficient compensation for the consumer? I think one of the things that basically should be done here is to have much more transparency with respect to how this data can be used, what the access and cost is, and to focus on some limits that might be used, especially in the context of the connectivity with people who might be interested in engaging in conduct that is not necessarily good for our society. But this data, and most consumers today are being asked to consent. How many times do you click on a cookie when you go on? But if you look at the form explaining what you're consenting to, no one ever reads it. It's 18 pages long, and it goes into a lot of things. And if you don't necessarily consent to the data being used, you may not have access to the service that's online. So even though we've built into consent with respect to the consumer, I don't think that's a fair balance of what the consumer knows the consequence of the data is for the consumer and society. But at the same time, the services are so beneficial that most people really are probably prepared to let that data be used as a consequence of having access to the service. But I think this is going to continue to be a significant focus by the regulators. And I think the Europeans are been more aggressive on this than we have in the United States. So I turn it over to Frédéric for his views.
So the question there is, who owns the data? Is that?
I think the companies say clearly that they do.
And
that-
the,
Okay, I'm a bit, let me continue to be an agent provocateur. You seem to indicate that you're upset at the fact that there are many ads that pop up on Google when you use Google.
I'm not upset. I just.
And my question is, why don't you use a browser that doesn't keep individual data? They exist for every service, free service that you get. You can find, so DuckDuckGo is an example of a browser. If you want to chat with people and exchange with them, you also have other apps like Signal that do not gather your data. The problem is that those companies, they exist, they're public, everybody knows them. I mean, you can go on Google and find them because they're not hidden, but nobody uses them. Now, there is a reason nobody uses them, which is the fact that because they have fewer users, they have less data and less good service.
I agree.
So when you say we should be paid for this data, aren't you paid by the quality of the service that you?
I raise that as an issue. That's come up in terms of yes, but the question then is there any limitation to what the data could be used for in terms of the kind of people that may have access to it? And that is a difficult question. I agree with that.
I just wanted so then there's the second question, which is, should things be clear and transparent? And I think that the answer there is absolutely yes. It does create a problem. Let me go rapidly into what the Europeans have done, because they have the toughest privacy law in the world, which they have adopted in 2018, precisely to solve the problem. And this law, which is called the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has a number of principles. The first one is that the processing by a platform of individual data, personal data, and by personal data, what is meant is that any data that could be used to identify you as a person, okay? So it can be your IP, it can be your name, it can be anything that could be used to, it's pretty wide definition of personal data. Any processing of personal data must be legal. And there are only 6 reasons for which they could be legal. The first one is that you as a user have given a permission to the platform to use your data precisely for whatever it is using it for. In other words, it's not a question of ticking a box and say, yeah, I don't care. It's a question of having specifically agreed to the fact that your data is going to be used either by advertisers or by third parties or by, which is, by the way, we can see how this can be protective because a few months ago in January, Facebook announced that, I think it was WhatsApp, announced that all the information that it gathers from WhatsApp users, and WhatsApp is one of the services of Facebook, would be translated, would be given to Facebook. So Facebook would gather the data from the different services. This was in the whole world, except in Europe, because in Europe, it's forbidden to say, I'm going to use the data of someone without that person having specifically said that it wanted this data to be used this way. So that's, okay. There are a few other cases if you have to comply with a legal obligation, etc. But the basic point is that your personal data cannot be used unless you have specifically allowed this use. And this use has to be specifically and precisely described. Second is that the platform cannot gather information except for the very purpose which it states. In other words, it cannot go on a fishing expedition of all your data. It must minimize the amount of data that it gets from you. It has limitation on the amount of time during which it can store this data. It must also keep the integrity of the data, and it must allow you to get your data back if you want to leave the service, okay? So this is the kind of protections of individual on their data. It is not quite the same as, paying for data. I'm wondering whether, paying for data is, first of all, the data is very useful, not in its raw form, which is the way it is gotten on the net, but when it is transformed, so it can be used by the algorithm. So the value of the data is not so much the data itself, but it is the transformation of it, okay? So the value to the platform of the data is not exactly the same as the value to you of the data, of the raw data. But it is a very protective law, which has severe sanctions, and the sanctions have started already, and which have discouraged Facebook, for example, from taking the WhatsApp data and put it into the Facebook stock of data to try to increase their source of data. So one can see that it limits to a certain extent the ability of those platforms from misusing the data or overusing the data.
Would that kind of a regulation be allowed in the states, for instance, or would it interfere from some legal or some rights that Americans have by our Constitution? Would it interfere with our freedom of speech in any way if we had those regulations here? I don't think so, but I'm asking.
Well, I think it raises, going back to questions 3 and 4, and there are 2 things that are happening in our society. First, with the amount of this data, we've begun to see alternative social media, so people are going to hear what they want to hear as opposed to getting a balanced point of view. And that is whether this is contributing to the growing divide in our society, because one of the things that's accompanied the digital growth is that the huge divide, stagnation of wages among much of our population, and the growing benefits to the top. And secondly, this media can be used to connect people to engage in activity that may not necessarily be highlighted by the January 6th march in Washington, where the connections would allow people to chat online, to create kinds of actions that led to the insurrection. This has been highlighted with respect to, for example, the stop game trading going on, where going on Wall Street bets through Reddit, people decided they were going to take on an institutional investor in short squeeze. So the real question is, do these platforms have any responsibility for what they permit to happen as a result of linkage or information available? And that really raises the question of, do they have consequences if illegal action takes place because of the linkage they provide? Or secondly, should they have the obligation to monitor and basically take off hate speech and other types of data that may be not the best interest? And this is what Facebook is really facing, this sort of challenge to be monitoring so that we don't permit this type of activity. And that, I think, is one of the issues that comes back to the First Amendment, because the platforms claim that they should basically not have responsibility for a variety of reasons. I think the better argument is the platform doesn't have free speech. It's basically the person that iterates that information that has the free speech right, but the platform may have obligations, because to the extent that it has an impact on the public, to do some kind of monitoring with respect to it. But that's a very difficult issue. It's been resisted in the US, and I think it will continue to be so. So the problem is that it may be providing beneficial services, but linkages can be provided with respect to hate information, with respect to other information that is really quite negative and can lead to actions that we really want to control, but it will be after the fact rather than before the fact. So I don't quite know. I think what I would like to see would be some international convention with respect to what obligations are with respect to platforms to monitor linkages that they provide and information that's available through them. But I doubt that the US will be willing to cooperate in this. And I think we're going to see the First Amendment basically invoke time and time again to preclude any kind of responsibility by the platform for consequences of information made available through it, notwithstanding its dominance in our society. But I'd be interested in what Frédéric thinks the appropriate regulatory response ought to be.
Well, I was going to go back for a second to the data protection regulation that we have in Europe. I said that it was great. It was very protective. It's been adopted, which means that there has been a concern about the issue, and it is enforced, which means that this regulation is effective. But there are several problems associated with it. The first one is that because you can take your data with you, if you are not on a small platform which is competing with a big platform, the big platform can say, come, bring your data, and I will give you a good service. And this is going to work against the small platforms, because they're going to lose, or they risk losing their, okay. So that's not always a good idea. The second issue that we have is the fact that it is a general regulation. It applies to all the data which is gathered on the internet, okay? So what this means is that you can refuse to allow the use of your data. For example, let's say there's an epidemic. They're a pharmaceutical company trying to find a vaccine. And for this, they need a lot of data to run their artificial intelligence algorithm. If a number of people say, oh, no, I exercise my right and I don't want my data to be part of this, this is going to clearly to have an effect on society in general. So the question is really whether we should have a general regulation which kind of applies, it's simple, but it applies in all cases, or whether we should have more targeted regulations, more sectoral regulations maybe, depending on the sector we're talking about. Maybe there are cases where data portability is a good idea and other cases where it's not such a good idea. Or there are cases where freedom of controlling your own information is entirely justified, and others where it is less justified. So there's been, I think that this is one of the reasons why in the US there's been kind of a reticence vis-a-vis the European style of regulation on data. except in California, because California has a system which is not too far from the European one. So I think that one has to be careful with the regulation, because a regulation, unlike competition law, a regulation applies to indiscriminately to the whole field of firms which come under the regulation. Now on the, so the next question is, which you started talking about. I would not venture to make any comment on the US context. The only thing that I notice is that we have not had in Europe the same consequences, and yet there are just as many people who are on those platforms all the time, but we have not had the same issue that you have on the political side. The concern about the fact that the quality of the data which is on the internet can interfere with the democratic process in many different ways. This hasn't come up. I mean, there is a lot of fake news which go around the internet, certainly, but this has not yet translated. I mean, maybe it will come, I don't know, but this has not yet translated into massive movements that would destabilize the democratic process and lead to extremes taking over in some way the political discourse. So there's a bit less, I mean, there's quite a bit, as a matter of fact, when Facebook decided to take off the account of, I think it was President Trump or someone like this, Mrs. Merkel made a comment that she saw that this was unacceptable, inconceivable, that a private platform should have any power whatsoever to monitor the content of what, and she made this statement publicly, even though she was maybe not so much on the side of President Trump for that matter, but because this is a bit more removed from what the discussion is like is about in Europe.
One of the interesting aspects in the US in terms of the ironic consequence of the First Amendment, if you remember, the First Amendment was invoked to basically preclude legislation that would restrict the ability of corporations to make political contributions to campaigns. And that has led to a huge growth in political contributions. And some of the most major players are basically Google and Facebook with respect to their trying to lobby with respect to avoiding legislation that would overly restrict or impose on them responsibilities. And, you know, some legislation was basically passed saying that platforms should have no consequences in terms of liability for libel or defamation with respect to what's being posted. And to the extent that we begin to look at how this data is used, these corporations have enormous political influence, and that raises a question again, do we need to step back? Google and Facebook don't disclose the amount of political contributions they make because they're not required to by law. There's been some movement among ethical investors to have that be required, but it's not yet. So I think one of the interesting things, the First Amendment permits this. Secondly, they use the First Amendment to explicitly get legislation to prevent them from being responsible for this. And so the question is whether it's going to be totally voluntary, whereby users of Facebook will put pressure on it. And I think that with respect to Trump, it was he lost his Twitter account and his Facebook page. I think the Facebook page may be restored, but not yet the Twitter. I'm just not sure. But again, that was voluntary by private. And that raises a question, can the platform discriminate? Could it? Right. That it would basically not permit some people who are of this particular persuasion. Also raises the question, can the platform permit governments like Russia to basically have access to data so they can run ads without disclosing the source of those ads to try to influence our elections? Or would regulating that be thought to be a violation of First Amendment rights? But these are some of the issues we're facing. And I think there's been no consensus in the US as to what response should be, even though we've had the Russia investigation, even though we've had the Trump concerns and so forth. And I'm not sure where we're going to go from there.
one of the reasons why, at least in France, but in several of the European countries, the discussion has not been as advanced on this as it has been in the US is, of course, the fact that firms cannot contribute. They have very severe limitation on what they can contribute to
Yes.
political campaign. So, so we don't have the suspicion that they are in some way financing or lobbying in some obscure way, I mean, some non-transparent way. And I think that this makes a difference. So we're more relaxed about this issue.
And to the extent that you have so many users in the US of both Facebook and Google, and who are so happy with their services, they don't want any legislation that may restrict or affect the quality of those services, notwithstanding the abuses that it may be resulting in terms of who has access to it. So that really, in some ways, is the danger. It's a free service that has made our lives entirely different. And so,
yeah, we're back to the first question. The problem is that there are positive, useful services that are the counterpart of all those evil or possible abuses. We are much more focused in Europe on a different type of abuse, an abuse under abuse of dominance, in particular with respect to Amazon, for example. The way, because Amazon, which is a different system than Facebook, but also using the data and etc. But Amazon is both a firm retailing, so it is a retailer and even a producer to a certain extent, and it is competing with other retailers that it lets access the platform. So it's both a marketplace and a retailer. So it is competing in some way with some of the other users, business users of Amazon. And there it seems that the use of the information, the strategic use of the information by Amazon has led to severe competitive problem. One of the things which is often argued is that it uses the data it has on how much its competitors sell to change the nature of its offer and compete with them and drive them out of the market. Okay, so because it is both, it has information because it's a marketplace, but it also has information because it is a retailer. So in there's been quite a bit of anxiety about how Amazon uses the data that it gets. But it's kind of a different discussion than the much more political one you have in the US.
yeah. But I think the last question is also one that really highlights, and that is that with more and more personal information that's exchanged on the net creates a security risk that we should worry about, and who should be in charge of cybersecurity. This, I think, has become a significant issue because we continue to have hacking that takes place and results in companies announcing that their sensitive information has been obtained. And the interesting issue is who is responsible for the security of the data collected and the consequences if it's basically hacked into. For example, with respect to information that may be obtained through hacking about your credit card information, should the site that basically had that information be responsible for the use? Does a credit card company have an obligation to monitor its use or whatever? And should the government, in my view, be working to try to enhance cybersecurity, working with companies so that we can really deal with this? Because the data trove is so large and there's so much information available that if obtained, it can be used for a variety of reasons. First of all, if it's hacked into and is not detected soon, the data can then be sold to other people who would like to have access to that data for services that they would like to provide or activity they'd like to engage in that may not be in our best interest. I think we should probably have in the US a special government department that would oversee the growth of artificial intelligence, the consequences of misuse of data, and working with the industry and perhaps other regulators globally to try to come up with some guidelines and protocols with respect to how we can implement this, because You hear more and more, even our law firm has had basically several attempts to hack into it with respect to having access to client data. And we have to constantly worry about the security and to consult people to do it. We can afford to do that, but maybe other companies that don't have that option. And I think there is a concern that this is an issue that has to be addressed. And the best way, I think, probably should be with more government intervention. But sadly, in the US, there's not much confidence in government to step in to deal with any of these problems. So what we need is more expertise. We need it at the government level. We need international coordination with respect to this. And we have to take this as a very serious problem, because with the amount of data that's been collected and continues to be collected, if it's misused, it can be catastrophic for consumers and other aspects of our society.
So first of all, I basically agree with you. The only difference is that being a European, we're less afraid of government. We're more afraid of competitors getting, or other firms, business firms, getting the information. But we would turn to government to try to improve cybersecurity. So I basically agree. I just want to add two nuances. One of them is that platforms work on the principle of trust. You are on a platform because you trust that the platform is going to give you a good service. You can trust that the platform is not going to do something which is going to be to your detriment. And we've had two natural experiments in this. So this means what? It means that if you're a platform, you have a huge incentive yourself in trying to protect the integrity of your system and to avoid any kind, to the extent that you can do it, any kind of cyber attack. And we've had two natural experiments of this. One of them was after, of course, there was the Cambridge Analytica example, which didn't do much good to Facebook. But there was another incident which was in January when Facebook precisely said that it was going to use the data which was on the WhatsApp accounts for its own purpose. That led to, I think, about 30 million people resigning their affiliation with WhatsApp and moving to competitors, Signal in particular, precisely because they were becoming aware of the fact that the protection of their own data was not ensured on WhatsApp, and they wanted to react to this. So in a sense, it was the first major incident when there was a huge reaction. Now, huge, I don't know, 30 million people seems like a lot of people to me, but given the number of people who were on WhatsApp, maybe it's not so impressive. But at least there was a reaction on the part of people. I don't want to deal with a platform which doesn't protect or which misuses my data. The second thing is that in those attacks, in most of the cases, the attackers cannot do something against you because we've had examples. As I said, what is useful is the data once it's been transformed into a usable form. Okay. So if you get access to the raw data, you get access to nothing, because unless you know how to use it, it's going to be useless. And this came up in Europe when there was a debate on what we call portability of data, the fact that if you leave Facebook to go to a competitor, can you take your data with you? Okay. So that the new service will have all your interests and will be able to give you a better service. And this debate had two dimensions. One of them, it sounded like a good idea. It would increase competition among platforms. But on the other hand, technicians, people who know about this said, but you know, the data which is on Facebook is absolutely unusable for any other service, even if it's offering the same type of service. Because in fact, it's only the data that interests Facebook, which has been gathered. And this data is a data which may be used given what Facebook wants to do with it. But if you're not Facebook, it's a data which is not very useful. Nevertheless, those hacking happen because they just want to prevent you from being able to continue what you do and to resell to you the data. So it's not so much for using the data for something else. I mean, I put aside the questions of Russia or China or places like this because there it becomes very political. But when those hackers are just trying to make money, they are not trying to use the data. They're going to try to block you so that you will pay to get your data back so that you can continue doing what you want because they cannot so much use the data themselves.
Yes, ransomware, that's right.
Isn't there some political problem with the use of data the way China uses it to follow people around? Isn't America, is the European Union afraid of that kind of use of data? Frédéric, discuss
what kind of use?
The Chinese phones, how they follow people with their phones, and whether our use of data can be used politically to follow people, to see what they're doing, to engage.
I don't think they follow French people.
Pardon? No, they
I
don't.
don't think they follow French people, so we don't care. No, but that's the question. I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are different political systems, there are different countries with some things are acceptable in some countries and not in others. So the fact that China has developed quite a bit into image recognition, which is, by the way, extremely useful for medicine. Okay, so, but it can also be used to control people. But this is a purely domestic matter in China. So if we believe that we are for human rights, or if we have governments which are in favor of human rights, this will be in the general bag of human rights in China, but it's not so much the use of technology, which is in question. Is the fact that you have an authoritarian regime. So it will be mixed with the Uyghur and various other. But the question of China is interesting because what is clearly happening, particularly with the tension between the US and China, which is goes over and beyond a particular administration, but a sense of competition between the two, is that the internet starts splitting. In other words, the internet in China is, I mean, a number of the Chinese internet firms cannot get access or cannot be operative in the US and vice versa. And one of the questions one has is whether we are going to move from an internet which was worldwide at the beginning to internets which are going to be regional because of political tensions between, which somewhere is going to be a bit of a losing proposition, because if you make it regional, you have fewer data, and if you have fewer data, you have fewer services. But on the other hand, it's going to protect the political integrity of each region. So, but there are a lot of people who think that we are in a period where maybe the universality of the internet is going to give way to a regionalization of the internet. There will still be the same amount of people or even more, but they will not be able to communicate throughout the world as much for political reasons. Whether that's a good thing, I don't know. It seems to me that cooperation, as Ed suggested earlier, first of all, is absolutely necessary for the very reason that the internet being global, and the firms on the internet, the platforms that we're talking about, operate in hundreds of countries, at least 100 countries. If each country has a different regulation, or if each country has a different, or puts barriers, you get a major loss of the benefits that technology could bring by splitting the net, or by creating discrimination in not discrimination, but differences in regulations, as I mentioned in the case of Facebook and WhatsApp. So I think that there is conscience of that. I think that this is one of the reasons, for example, why the question of the taxation of the platforms was handed over to the OECD, which is not a universal body, but at least it's a body with a fairly wide representation, to try to find a cooperative solution to this problem. And the US government just mentioned yesterday, I think, that it was open to finding a solution in this context. So that's an example of increasing cooperation among countries to solve a digital problem, which is a worldwide problem, where local solutions are either very clumsy or they are destructive of the benefit of the internet. So more cooperation is needed. That's what I would say. And more cooperation would be needed, in particular, on the treatment, on the antitrust treatment of those problems, certainly between Europe and the US, for example. Now, if I interpret well the recent report by the staff of the US House of Representatives on those issues, they take a very European approach to this problem. So there may be a convergence of, we are going to see what comes out of, I think that Mrs. Klobuchar and Mr. Cicilline have presented draft bills, and they would go in the direction that Europe has taken, being tough on dominance and particularly on digital dominance. So I think cooperation and convergence are a better way to try to deal with those issues than confrontation.
And we've had significant cooperation in terms of regulation of capital markets with respect to the growth of derivatives and other unusual security type transactions. The question is whether we can expand that to really focus on regulation or oversight of some of these platforms, given their enormous power. I mean, Apple was the first US company to have more than $1 trillion of market valuation. That was staggering. The fact that we have a company like that has the largest capitalization of a company in the United States. I mean, that really suggests where we're moving in terms of our economy, and that really poses enormous challenges for us. But we have a divided society, and we will not have consensus on this, in my view, in the near future. And therefore, there will be very likely not much agreement as to whether more regulation should be imposed on the consequences of what may happen by using the platforms. And with that, I think
there was one comment in the discussion that I wanted to mention in the discussion box, which was about whether there was some kind of nationalism in the way in which the Europeans were treating the platforms, because, as Ed said, certainly the Europeans have been more proactive and have gone after Amazon. There's a case against Amazon now in Europe. There have been cases against Google. There have been cases against Microsoft. I just want to answer that question because I've been in antitrust for a long time. When you look at who the US Justice Department goes after when it comes to cartels, it's mostly foreign firms. Okay. It's Koreans and Japanese and Europeans who end up in jail, in US jails, for having fixed prices, either the world over or in the US. And of course, some people in Europe say, the US is going after the Europeans or the rest of the world. And I think that this is not true. I think that what happens is that there is more knowledge of antitrust laws in the US than there is in other parts of the world. And as a result of which, some European businesses or some Asian businesses do things which American firms wouldn't do because they know what the consequences would be. So those who get caught are the foreigners. Now, back to the question of, it happens that the internet developed in the US, thanks, by the way, to the US government, as I said, because it was in the DARPA program that the internet was originally developed, as a result of which the largest firms that use the internet or are present on the digital level tend to be North Americans, They are dominant. We don't like dominant firms. We go after European dominant firms all the time, but not in the digital world, because in the digital world, there are no European, much to our, we're very sorry for that, but there are no European firms that are particularly dominant. So I think that it's not a question of going after foreign firms. It's a question of going after dominance, because as I said, we've always had an anti-dominance dimension to our antitrust, much more than in the US, where dominance was not used, but monopoly was considered to be the reward for having been an extremely good competitor, prevailed over your competitors. So it was not necessarily a negative thing. So I think that this explains why the European Union has been aggressive against those firms, because they were dominant, not particularly because they were US, just like the US Department of Justice has been aggressive against European and Asian cartels, not because they were European or Asian, but because they were doing things that they shouldn't have done under US law.
Can you address very briefly what would happen if we treated these big companies the way Ma Bell and the railroads were treated, and they were broken up? How do you see that affecting the internet? Rather than regionalism, but just breaking them up because they're too big.
Well, as I explained, we are in a field where the technology means that the bigger you are, the more data you have access to, the better is going to be your service. So one of the consequences of splitting the firms is going to be that they are going to have there are going to be fewer people on each platform, and the level of service is going to be lower. Is that a good thing? I don't know, but it's not obvious that it's a good solution. Regulation may be a better solution than a structural remedy, as one says in antitrust. Why? Because there is this technology that leads, that makes that dominance good with quality.
Yeah. And that's why I think why Google is so dominant with respect to searching, because it does provide better quality. And so to break it up is going to basically, I think he's right. So I'd rather have regulation and oversight rather than breaking it up simply because of its size. And again, what would the size be? What would you focus on? Revenues? Would you focus on usage? And how would you then, if you broke it up, would they be precluded from cooperating to share information, or whether they have to be totally separate, which would make it much, much less efficient than we have today? So I think there's not much sentiment in the US, at least, to break them up, though there are some academics that are really calling for that because they don't trust the impact on society, given how large and dominant Google and Facebook are.
There is another possibility in terms of breaking them, which is to break them not by size, I mean, by dividing them into two, but to ask that Facebook, for example, abandon some of the other platforms that it has acquired in the past. Okay. One of the difficulties with this is that very often the algorithm that a platform has can be used for different purposes. Okay. So there are huge economies of scope in having different types of activity, having search engine, having a social media function, having, I don't know, photo exchange. When you have a common algorithm that allows you to do all those different things. For example, TikTok last month announced that it was going to go into e-commerce. Well, TikTok is an exchange place where you can exchange videos, but it has found that its algorithm can be very useful to develop another function, which is the function of retailer. Okay. Now, if you split it, you say, no, you cannot. Either you exchange videos or you're a retailer, but you can't do both, which is another way to cut down the, you lose the benefit of having one technology applicable to two things. And there are some, so it's not very economical. I mean, it reduces the efficiency of the economy to do that. So I don't see personally, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen, because in particular, the House of Representatives report I was mentioning was very much in favor of splitting, particularly Facebook in this case. But I don't think that it makes much economic sense, personally. I would much rather have some kind of regulation, maybe not a general regulation, maybe a set of sectoral regulations, or depending on the business model of the platforms, with an agency in charge of this regulation.
And you will also see in the US that there will be a rallying of people who will be opposed to the House of Representatives recommendation, because that is one thing that Google and Facebook have been able to do, to marshal their users to basically oppose any regulation they think is going to jeopardize the business they provide, and their followers are very loyal to what they provide. And so that's why I think that while it's there, it's not likely to happen, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, we're back to the political influence that firms can.
I have a question from someone who says, what if the split were along the line of paying users whose information would not be used and sold, and those who wished to continue as non-paying customers?
But that exists already. As I said, if you want the search engine where your information is not going to be used, it exists. It's called DuckDuckGo. A couple of commentators have said, well, I've tried it. It's not as good as Google, so that's why I don't want it. But so you have a search engine that doesn't use information, and you have others like Google that use the information.
And you also have advertisers where you can pay for Spotify. You can pay for Spotify and not have the ad.
You have many fewer advertisers on a platform that doesn't gather information, because it's like going back to the newspaper. When you advertise in the newspaper, you have no notion whether anybody ever reads your advertising. So you pay, your advertising is paid as a function of the circulation of the newspaper, because that's the only indication. So you say, well, you know, I've got 50,000 people reading my newspaper, okay, so I can charge you this and that. But it's a very inefficient way to advertise, because you have no notion of what happens to your advertisement. One of the benefits, if one thinks that advertising is a useful social function, one of the benefits of the internet is that it allows you to know whether the people on the internet have clicked on your ad or not. So that's much more effective in terms of controlling the quality of and the effectiveness of the advertising.
Would you address the issue of whether the newspaper should pay the Google, or Google should pay the newspaper for newsworthy and news information?
This is a huge issue. I don't know about the US, but it's a huge issue in Australia,
Yes.
Spain, France, and Germany. Australia, the competition authorities has just promoted a code that will make it mandatory for the platforms to pay for the snippets that they use from newspapers. And there've been fierce, as you know well, there've been fierce reaction, particularly from Facebook, which has in fact cut off all its news service in Australia, only for a time, and then has finally relented and decided that it would earmark $1 billion to pay for, not only for Australia, but for all the countries where there's this issue. In Spain, Google stopped the service, I think, for a year of Google News, because the newspaper insisted that they wanted to be paid for the snippets. And the argument, which is the same as the argument which is being discussed now in France, is the following. The newspapers say you use what we produce to make your platform more attractive, because people can look at the news in a very easy way. So you should pay for this content that you're using. What Google says is, when I have an item that comes from Le Monde, it's identified as Le Monde. And what it means is that people are going to click on Le Monde internet site or the newspaper's internet site. So I'm bringing customers to you. So you should pay me for the snippets that I use. And the problem is that statistics are not very good. There have been a couple of studies which have been undertaken when Google stopped Google News or discontinued Google News in Spain. Some of them suggest that there was a decline in the number of visitors of the sites of the newspapers of 10%. And others say that there was a little decline at the beginning, but then after that, people went back. So it's not very conclusive. What is very clear is that at the European level, there's been a directive, which is kind of a regulation, saying that indeed platforms should pay for newspaper. I mean, should pay for the newspaper's extract that they have. Now there are sub-issues which are amusing. One of them is, okay, Google News uploads an article from a newspaper which has a photograph, and the photograph comes from a photographic agency. Who should be paid for the photograph? Is it the newspaper because it was part of the article, or is it the photographic agency? So we do have,
Or is it the photographer?
Oh, no, well, presumably the photographer was working for the agency and he got paid, or I don't know that, but you're right.
Right, she's there.
But the point is that France was the first one to, when you have a European directive, then you have to have a national adaptation of your own domestic regulation. And France was the first one to adapt the European regulation and said that from now on, Google and Facebook and the others have to pay for the snippets that they publish coming from the newspaper. The next question was how much? So Google said 0, and I'm going to pay you 0. And by doing this, I'm doing you a favor. The newspaper said, no. The law says that you have to pay us something, you have to pay. And that's where we are. And right now there is a tense discussion about exactly how much they should be paid. But after that, it's going to be all of Europe. I mean, and what's interesting in the discussion in Europe is that, of course, Google and Facebook know that the way the European regulation is going to be adapted in France is then going to be a model for the other 25 European countries. So that's why they are so tough in the negotiation.
And the reason this issue is so important is because there are so many newspapers that are going out of business because their advertising revenue has declined because of the shift to digital advertising growing on Google. We've had 1,800 newspapers that have gone out of business in the United States. And that really puts pressure. We want social media. We don't want the only source of our information to be through Google and Facebook. We want the New York Times and others. But in fact, these newspapers are really struggling because their circulation is going down and their advertising revenue is going down because of access to social media. So
let me be a devil's advocate one last time tonight, and that will be it. What you say is absolutely right, but there could be two reasons. One of them is that people have decided to want to read the news on the sites, on the digital sites. And there is some indication, for example, that there are people who get all their news from Facebook. I mean, they never buy a newspaper or never even go to the site of a newspaper. But there's another possibility because the press, at least in Europe, was in bad shape. The newsprint were in bad shape way before the advent of the internet. When the internet came, what a lot of newspapers did in Europe was just to put the newspaper on their site. But you don't read on a screen the same way that you read on. The screen is an interactive thing. So it's a place where you may want to read a little extract and then be able to go to a deeper analysis and so on and so forth. So you just can't put the newspaper the way it is presented in paper form on the screen. It doesn't work. And a few newspapers who got this early on have done very well with their digital sites and are making quite a bit of money. I mean, there are very few of them. So, okay, I completely agree with the fact that a lot of people read the news on the internet, and that to a certain extent, I mean, some of that news is not read on newspaper anymore because the internet is there, so that's clear. On the other hand, whether the newspapers have done what they should have done, which is to try to understand how communication on the internet works and to adapt their, now, they didn't do it because A, they were not familiar with this digital mean, B, because they didn't have money to hire new journalists to be able to present the content as it should have been presented, but it could be also the fact that they were not as good as the platforms in terms of presenting their product.
I think we're now at the end of our time, Jane, that we've done.
I was about to say the same thing and to thank both of you for this very interesting and deep delve into artificial intelligence. And I hope all of you who are still with us have enjoyed it. Margaret, thank you for the use of your library. Please don't forget to donate to the library if you can, when you can. We appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
And I will send my slides if you want to have them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Good night.
Okay. Thank you.